I agree. I think it is a societal issue. And we need to recognize that. I mean, yesterday, as I normally do, I go to the beach on mornings, and typically on Saturday mornings before Kadooment Day, 4 day morning, by the time around the time I normally go, most of the people are gone. But if they might have started later or whatever the case may be, there were a lot of revelers on the beach. And the one thing that struck me, in fact, I said to one of the group with whom I swim, I said, if we're not careful, we'll get a contact high. There was so much marijuana smoking. And then there were some young men who were in close proximity sitting on the beach. And then they came in I am concerned really and truly about the prevalence of use, the consequence of that use, particularly on minors. And I say that, and I tried to find some research on Barbados, um, and I came across a couple articles. I didn't find too much, but I didn't have a lot of time to search. But I'll share a couple titles in relation to work done in Jamaica, because as one of the articles said, marijuana smoking has been pretty prevalent in Jamaica for years, but with the decriminalizing of it, you have seen a significant increase in use of school children. And one article here said ganja babies, more and more children reportedly seeking medical attention after using marijuana. And then it went into some statistics and so on. And one article, it's an article called, and I have it here in front of me for those who may think I am making this up. It's Get the Statistics. Drug use in Jamaica talks about male use is higher than female use for all ages. And the statistics go from 12 years to 14, 15 to 17, in term up to 55 to 65 years. And this is, I'm not going to read the article because, as you say, we're looking at several things this evening. But this article starts up with saying a 50% jump in the number of children seeking assistance at public medical facilities for ganja-related illnesses in Jamaica since the weed was decriminalized in 2015. It's causing worry for local health officials. And I'll read the second paragraph. With 70% of the population having easy access to ganja and law making possession of up to 2 ounces no longer a criminal offense, children, some as young as 12 years old, have been trying the weed in its many forms. And I think that's important. And it says, I read the last paragraph in this thing, well, it says, Health Minister Dr. Christopher Tufton last week, this article, as I said, was a 2017 article, said, told the Sunday Gleaner that he was very unhappy with the findings. And this is a quote, the drug treatment program of the ministry, primarily for persons affected by marijuana usage, and in particular since the decriminalization of 2 ounces or less, has shown a 50% increase in persons, young people, school children, adolescents, which raises a lot of concern for us. And then there was another story where more than 60 children have been taken to hospital in Jamaica after eating sweets containing cannabis. And that was from the Minister of Education. Now, if we saw that happening immediately after the decriminalizing in Jamaica, my question is, what is happening in Barbados?
Can I interject here to ask Maxine a question?
Yeah,
Mhm.
sure.
Oh yes, okay. The Canada has, we're talking about decriminalizing, but Canada has legalized. I
Mhm.
would love to see research coming from that country based on know that there is legalized in Canada, what is happening among the youth. Because we're talking about legalizing.
Now that is something I would need to go at. What I can tell you is I've actually seen the inside of one of the dispensary things. I mean, because this is recreational marijuana. What we have in Barbados, because I don't know if well, I think it was mentioned on a previous program because there was an advertisement um, just before late last week. Let me put it that way, targeting Barbadians as they enjoy crop over. I don't remember. I don't know if you remember. If you saw
Yeah, I
that,
remember that. Yeah.
Pastor Ferdinand.
No, I didn't.
If I, while we're talking, I will see if I can pull it up on my phone and I'll send it to you.
Okay.
But they essentially were suggesting, in fact, let me look as we speak. They were essentially suggesting that you should enhance your enjoyment of the celebrations by visiting them.
I heard about it. I heard about
And
it.
I will
Yeah,
look.
but I
I
haven't
will
seen
look
it.
and send it to you now. And it was circulated. These were advertisements found on the Instagram page of one of these licensed distributors. Now, according, and I spoke to this yes, I did speak to this, because according to our laws governing pharmacies, and the dispensing of medicinal marijuana essentially comes under that kind of arrangement. It has to be dispensed by a medical doctor. Pharmacies cannot legally advertise. Oh, I know what it was. It was on the call-in program, not this program that I raised it, because the moderator, Mrs. What's her name now? She's an attorney. The name will come back.
I think Turton, is it?
Yes, Mrs. Turton. She started out the program making reference to this. And I immediately went online and did the research to look at two things. One, the legislation governing the this company that is dispensing medicinal marijuana, as it is called, and to recognize that it has to be done on the prescription. Now, if it is a prescribed substance, medication, like a pharmacy, and the pharmacies in Barbados operate under legislation, the Pharmacies Act, which says that you cannot advertise to the public prescribed drugs. If you're selling chocolates, over-the-counter medications for headaches, coughs, etc., that do not require prescription, you can advertise publicly you can advertise directly to John on Jane Public. So my whole question was, and I called on the authorities. There's an authority governing the production and processing and all of that, distribution of medicinal marijuana, to clarify for the public what the case was. Now Pedro Gemmet is asking me a question: what is medicinal marijuana? I am just using the language, because some will argue that there's no difference. I am using the language of the legislators and the policymakers who are in office at this point in time, because I also want to be clear in my mind what is the essential difference between that and the other substances that people use called marijuana, who use it for recreational purposes. So I think what is happening is, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mark. No, when you're finished, Mark.
I was saying what we have is a situation where there is need for clarification coming from the government, because if what I saw advertised is allowed to continue, then it is making a mockery of any attempt to put legislative constraints and frameworks in place to govern what is identified as a medicinal marijuana product or set of products. That Vihoy has here, she says, you're concerned about marijuana, be concerned about alcohol, which is highly addictive, the crack, trunk, etc. And I want to share a personal experience. The first grandchild in my family, who happens to be 7 years younger than me, was, I would say, to a large extent destroyed by something that they call blackies. And that is the putting of crack cocaine into marijuana. Right? And he was never the same again. You try to get off of it and so on. And the concern is that people go and they consume marijuana. And so this probably opens up a bigger discussion, which ties in with what Alvin just said about the control of the substance for recreational purposes. A lot of people do not know what they're getting. They are getting marijuana mixed with all kinds of chemicals, mixed with other addictive, highly addictive drugs that people see it as a gateway. And I also draw a distinction. I've never tried it. I remember as a student in America, people couldn't understand how this woman from the Caribbean never used marijuana. I said, I've never had an interest. But I have seen a number of things happen locally and internationally. People concerned about alcohol, which is highly addictive. And I would say this, we have a population of very heavy drinkers in this country. I would also say we also need to do the research outside of persons who have become alcoholics, because I would want to know what has happened to persons who are heavy users of marijuana, how it impacts their bodies and another addictive substances, because we are seeing the increasing use of other kinds of substances. But I also will tell you there's something that happens. And again, I have seen examples of this. And I asked the question, there are two questions I asked. I once asked it of a pediatrician who had indicated to me that this is something that would need to be researched. But my question is, what is the impact of heavy marijuana use, either by one or both parents, on babies and young children, newborn babies and children and young children? Because I've seen some things which suggest to me that there perhaps is, based on anecdotal evidence, let me put it that way, and not empirical evidence. That's why I spoke to the pediatrician about it, to find out if we've done any research, that it does impact children, or I would say probably as early as, in vitro, before the child is born, fetuses, etc. And that there's certain behaviors that seem to manifest. I don't know what percentage, what was the incidence of something like this, what percentage of children may be affected, and how, what are the factors beyond perhaps frequent marijuana use. But my thing is that we need to study more closely what is happening. As I said, I've shared a couple examples of what's happening in Jamaica. My understanding, again, the professionals will have to come and confirm or otherwise, that because children 12 and under, their brains and so on are still developing, the impact of marijuana use will have significant and perhaps even different kinds of effects on other persons. And I would say this in the case of people who suffer from chemical imbalances and manifest in bipolarism and so on. I can tell you that I know of cases where those young people, because of the genetic makeup, for want of a better word, had extreme reactions to marijuana use. So it is, there are a lot of issues we need to hear about. But that's not so long ago. Now, that's the reason why it is very important that we have more research done on so many fronts. Because even if I start with the comment that VHOI has here, that is, they've contaminated by other drugs and calling it medicinal marijuana. But the other thing, and again, you see, I know of a young man who left here and went to Canada and had, I would have to call it a psychotic break I would have to get a clarification from persons connected to him. But from what I understood, the young man smoked marijuana here, but because it was probably illegal when he left here, access to it was not the same as when he went to Canada. Because it was available, and because I think things to do with potency and all of these things impacted on him. So he was able to get it freely and probably enjoy, and abused it. Let me put it that way, in the same way we talk about alcoholics abusing, alcohol and so on. Adrian Hines is correct. If pregnant women drink alcohol and smoke, Smoking tends to lead to complications, to underweight babies and so on. And so all of these things, and it is for people to be educated about these. I think some people will say, well, marijuana is a plant, but the truth is rum made from sugarcane.
Sugarcane.
Apply too.
It's a
But
plant.
all of these things can have differential impacts on your body. Some people seem to be able to, So I think at the end of the day, as you correctly said, Pastor Ferdinand, the issue of substance abuse, the essence of abuse of anything, and and things that are addictive or cause people to become addicted to them. These are issues that we have to look at. But for me, when we talk about education now, my question is, what is the impact on our children if they are exposed to the use of any of these substances too early? I mean, because it now is going to compound some of the other concerns, because I think there was a very specific reason why you wanted to touch on educational issues tonight. But this certainly is something that's going to compound it, because we talk about actual use, but and remember you talked about in the same way that side stream smoke from tobacco smokers was problematic for non-smokers. Contact highs are also a reality.
Yeah, to our attention. Go ahead.
Where he said medicinal marijuana is supposed to have a lower levels of THC, and that is all. And that is part of what I understand. But I saw an earlier comment where people make the comparisons and contrast with alcohol, for example, and then highlight the problems with other more serious drugs. My question to the audience, what is your position on the use of marijuana, full stop? That is what I would want to hear from people. We know that it is used, but what is your position? And there was my last point is in relation to the person, I think it was V. Hoy, who mentioned that when business people realized that they could make money from it, I guess it is something to which they paid attention and acted upon. But I also remember, because I'm thinking of the industry in the region, and I remember because we know that in St. Vincent and the Grenadines for years, even though it was illegal, it was cultivated. And I remember the comment of a former diplomat from St. Vincent and Grenadines making the point that perhaps the country was making money from it because it was illegal. But from the time it becomes legal and you compete with those larger foreign countries doing it, you probably will see a different situation. And that perhaps explains, because right now, as much as the government has spent millions of dollars supporting what they have described as a medicinal marijuana industry, those businesses cannot use commercial banks or other financial institutions per se. A similar problem, because it continues to be illegal in certain states, rather, not
Right,
cities,
right.
certain states in the US. And banking, even for those states where they can legally operate these shops, etc., people largely do business in cash. So I don't see a short-term end to that. And my question, therefore, is, and I think I heard somebody speaking on behalf of the government talking about engaging some other financial institutions outside of the Western world. But the reality is we have had a challenge with correspondent banking. That is with those banks with whom we have to interface to do international transactions. And that is not going to change soon. And therefore, I think it is going to create a problem. And therefore, another problem that we may have is that you may find yourself having to deal in some funny waters when it comes to money transactions.
To the use of branding. But I'd like to get back to education if you can.
I wanted to speak, if I could, Ferdy, to your question about the technology being abused and I would say the challenges or the limitations or weaknesses of technology. And while Glenn was speaking about the UK, I went to verify some information I know I had come across before, because we in this part of the world like to follow And it happens because some of these Western countries and so on have the financial resources to stay ahead of the game, so to speak. But Sweden, and we talk about
Right.
Sweden, one of those economies. And I'll read what some of the information that came up. And as you said, technology helps you to pull up some detailed information in seconds. And it says, because I'd seen this before, Sweden is shifting its educational approach to a more traditional back to basics model, emphasizing printed books, handwriting practice, which brings you to what Alvin was saying, and reduce reliance on digital devices. This change is a response to concerns about declining reading comprehension and focus among students, despite Sweden's previous embrace of digital learning, including the widespread use of tablets in schools. So the key elements of the shift, they're reintroducing printed textbooks, as I said, focusing on handwriting and reading. They're saying there's what they call a balanced approach to technology, is not to eliminate technology, but to ensure that the digital tools enhance rather than dominate learning. And then they talk about teacher expertise and so on. And they said they're declining, the distractions, impact on fine motor skills, need for balanced approach, etc. So I think what we are seeing is what other countries, because they were a step or steps ahead of us, are now seeking to address the very things that are manifesting themselves. But outside of technology, I think that our system, we need to focus on the foundational things, making sure that people can reason, they can write, they have certain numeracy skills, etc. And then we can start to so the video, because we haven't touched on that, the video in Jamaica, they're saying, look, we cannot leave students behind. And the irony about leaving students behind is a situation where people may continue to be promoted and ignored because they are not functioning at the requisite level. So they are saying that you may have to have students repeat certain class, at certain stay in the class rather than be. And so I think this is something we have to look at.
But obviously there seems to be some conflict going on here. Maxine, I'm going to give you first.
I can go first. I will be bold and go first. And I actually tried while you were speaking to Glenn, because I didn't get a chance earlier to listen to Minister Sutherland, who presented the resolution in Parliament. Mm-hmm. And I would ask Mr. Sutherland to demonstrate to me, I heard him make some references, that the government in fact owns this land. So before we even can compare and think about government giving away land that belongs to them, I would say the government would need to prove to me that they own the land. And I don't have a lot of time to go into it, but once you do the research and understand, and I noticed there's a reference to the Anglican Church Act, but that I recommend people go to read it. But at the end of the day, the critical thing that government has to establish is that they own the land in the first instance. And one of the things that you would find is that the Anglican Church, through a process of receiving gifts, etc., because he made reference to a plantation owner and all of these things, which I don't have time to go into now, but I would tell you that I would further research it, that a lot of times lands would have been gifted to the church. Some of it would have been acquired by the church, and the church used some of those lands to create a series of schools. So, for example, and a lot of them you would hear about St. Bartholomew's School, St. Stephen's School, Junior, and that's where I went to school, for example. A lot of those would have been built on school lands, because I think it would have been Bishop Coleridge. I mean, the church has a history connected to slavery, of course, and then another part of the history was an effort to seek to educate Blacks through the establishment of schools, etc. And so these schools would have been part of the church and the diocese, and then they became, when the government of the country took over, education, etc., they utilized these school properties. I made reference to that to indicate that for the most part, in fact, you would generally find that in fact, government ended up at some point continuing to use in recent times 14 of those school buildings and returning other buildings which they no longer needed to use to the diocese. I'll give an example. St. Stephen's, when I was a school girl, when I was 10, when I was 5, between 5 and 10, I went to St. Stephen's Infants and St. Stephen's Junior. Those two buildings were owned by the church, and when the government, and there's a whole process we won't go through with this establishment and so on, but I'm not going to confuse people with that. When the government handed back those properties, they not only handed them back, but they also, in some instances, had to pay to try to restore the buildings. But so I would pause there. I don't want to hog the show, but I would say, as a former trustee, I would ask the government to demonstrate to me, based on all that I know, that it has ownership of that land and therefore is in a position to sell it. And I would end by saying that it is not the first time that government would be wrong. We recently had an article in the paper talking about paternity leave coming into effect when in fact there's no legislation to do that. So because government says so does not make it right. I will pause there and speak later if I have some more time.
Because I'm looking at this paragraph on the screen right now, which I'm sure you can read. You have the information there relative to the aspect of the connection between the church and the plantation. Isn't that something that I'm reading there?
Yeah, but they're talking about paying rent to Bath Plantation. Now, all of these things, they would need to verify and so on. Because exactly. I as I said, I'm not comfortable with some of the conclusions that are drawn, because based on these things, I know that you have to ensure at the end, because they're talking about the 70s and so on, and whether these lands. So I would have to do further investigation. My other concern is that we're talking about a piece of land, but they also demolished 2 buildings.
Yes, that's what it actually was said.
So if you go back up there, it says here, and subsequent to that request, the property has been leveled, the church and the school knocked to the ground. So I think, and it's interesting because I while y'all were speaking, because I had printed out the resolution, and I think part of it has to, the question was what they're really looking to use this for. And I think that it was done to provide, it says here, the arrangement, the state sold the land, let me see, to the, at a meeting held on 29th, and this is an addendum to the resolution. The resolution basically is approved the lease to the Pilgrim Holiness Church, the Wesleyan Holiness of a parcel of land situated at Bath. It says the property of the state, but the church is going to lease the land, but they want to operate. I think there's a switch in because the church exists somewhere, and I think from what I heard Mr. Sutherland saying, they're switching lands so that they can set up, I think it's a community center. So maybe that explains in part the haste. But all I would say, Glenn has been very clear as to the value of following processes. Bureaucracy is not, as Glenn suggested, a question of inefficiency and time wasting. It is about having processes and procedures that allow you in a very systematic way to establish or to undertake activities. So in this case, establishing ownership and determining once and for all who has the rights. Because it is not only that, the question is, how does that piece of land affect other property that may be owned by the church and so on, and how does it impact on what the church may have plans to do or is currently doing on land that may be contiguous to that and so on. So it is not a simple matter. I remember sitting in meetings back in 2005-06, because that's when I was appointed a trustee back in June of 2005. You sent me, Pastor Ferdinand, to my archives. And I was able to see, and I actually remember meeting in November 2005 to discuss the payment for schools used by government and so on. So when we start to talk about schools, I mean, it sends up a red flag for me as to what is the ownership and what are the current, or what were the previous arrangements in relation to those buildings and lands. And I wait to hear what the chairman does. I will do my own research as a former trustee. I know the current trustee, and I know members of the synod as well, which is another part of the administration of the church. But the trustees, at the end of the day, they exist to address issues of property of the church. In fact, I will say this: a church cannot on its own undertake to do certain kinds of repairs, or should not undertake to even do repairs to the buildings, because the building is not owned by the parish. It is owned by it is in the care of the trustees. And all of those things are written in legislation. One of these days I will maybe do a presentation to speak a bit more on this. And I agree with Vihoy, the church needs to speak out. As a member of the church, and interesting enough, after a number of years, I am now serving on my church council. I'm also the chair of the finance committee at St. Stephen's Church. So I have
you get a big picnic.
But you know,
colleagues, here are my notes, and you can see that they've been around for a little while. These notes,
paper yellow. Paper yellow.
It's a yellow page. It's a yellow page. It's a yellow notepad. But
is it a yellow page, or it turned yellow from here?
No, it's a yellow notepad. It's turning pale. But these notes actually are of a meeting with the minister, with the Prime Minister's office. And interestingly, if they want to have some advice, it's interesting. The meeting was, I think he was then permanent secretary. This was the 3rd of the 24th of March, 2006. And the meeting was with the then Mr. Alan Jones, who happened to be
permanent secretary,
Sunday school teacher when I was a child, and who after retiring from government became an Anglican priest.
That's right.
And basically in this note, we were actually discussing the government at the time was occupying 40 schools still and so on. But in my notes, and I wrote this, and it is written here, I'm reading from this line here. I have here written, it is possible to review the files dealing with the entire negotiations. This is about school properties and so on. Mr. and I have in brackets, Sir Neville Osborne was director of finance. So this is nothing new. And Glenn will tell you that you probably can find the files.
Of course, if they send out files.
Mr. Neville Osborne at the time was probably dealing with this issue. You see, I don't understand how these latter-day politicians behave. That's the only way I can describe it. At the end of the day, and this is the beautiful thing about our government bureaucracy, you can go back and find critical information if you take the time to do so. Yes. And this would have been Glenn's experience. It certainly was mine, that when certain issues came before me, I always had an interest in history, and that was when, so maybe that is why I found it. But I always found it intriguing when a file that had been around for a long time ended up on my desk, that I could go back. I wasn't just turning to the current. I could go back and read.
It's important.
And get a proper picture. So I would say to these people, maybe Reverend Alan Jones, as I say, former senior public officer and my former Sunday school teacher, who I used to give a little bit of trouble to as a child. And I confess that, Pastor Ferdinand.
That's okay. Confession is good for the soul.
Good for the soul.
So Maxine,
to go and do the research. Yes, sir.
Did he pray for you or pray for you?
I hope he prayed for me, not pray for me.
But I see Developmental asking, but how they could go and knock down a church building?
Well, you see,
and a school too.
Yeah,
It's
but
the
you see, this
the
is
same government that took our flag and we watch it going in the grave.
yeah.
So
Listen,
don't be
when you
surprised.
want to do what you want to do, because once the building is knocked down,
That's
there's
it.
little, you know, I mean, they can
That's it.
replace it, the
Yeah,
building, they
but
can do a
yeah,
replica, but it
But
done knocked down
but
already.
but
You
go
know,
ahead.
in relation to national insurance and the ability to repair, because I can understand the anger, the agony, and all of that of pensioners, because I remember when this thing first surfaced, there was a lady who you could describe in similar terms, and when she worked out, she was 85 or more at the time. And when she looked, she said, well, I won't be around to receive my benefits. Now, I'm going to raise an issue and ask a question in this after making a comment. The Prime Minister, in talking about the need to find about 60,000 more people, she was essentially saying that the government has indicated that in order to maintain the integrity of the national insurance scheme, we need to maintain, and I wrote down the word a healthy workforce, but I don't mean healthy in terms of physical health. I mean healthy in terms of numbers and persons contributing. Okay, and you cannot dispute that's necessary to keep the scheme going, because that's how it is done. Against that background, therefore, I want to ask the Prime Minister, as Minister of Finance, as head of government, and to the Minister of Labor, as a man, I would call him of almost of the cloth, because he's an elder in his church and all of that. Is there any truth that there are workers, foreign workers or non-national, because I don't believe CARICOM workers would work for this, but I can't swear, who are working at a hotel under construction, who are receiving, I would say, in their hands, I use this word, are receiving US $24.70 a day, and the equipment operators receiving $30 a day. And when the person sent this to me, my first question is, where are they accommodated and how much money are they paying? So, or how much money is the owner of the accommodation receiving per worker? And I raise that because I will not imagine that equipment operator will get gross $60 Barbados, because it says 30 US. And the question is, are these workers, first of all, paying national insurance because they're employed in Barbados in place of other workers? Are they doing jobs that Barbadians refuse to do or cannot be found? And on what basis are they being paid this kind of money, if that is the case? In other words, are they receiving money net of money removed, taken for accommodation or anything else? Or are you paying somebody outside of Barbados a portion of their salary to be distributed or whatever in any way? But so my question is, against the background, and I'm repeating myself for emphasis, against the background of what we understand is necessary for the national insurance scheme to continue to meet its obligations in the future, and against the background of the kind of wages that are typically paid, are people paying this, and what else are they receiving, either in the form of accommodation and or meals or anything else, or the payment of part of their salary outside of Barbados? So is this what exactly is happening? And I mentioned the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Labor, but I also call on the main trade union in Barbados, which is the one that mobilizes workers outside, across the country, let me put it like that, beyond the public service, the head of the Barbados Workers Union and now Member of Parliament, Tony Moore, to speak to this issue. If it is a lie, come and debunk it fast so that it does not gain legs. If it is true, tell us why this is
That is the
happening
truth.
and what is the full extent of wages paid. Who are these workers? Where are they from? How were they recruited? Where are they accommodated? Because this smacks of exploitation in the absence of fuller explanations. I used to be a minister for 11 months responsible for immigration, and people took, as the British, I said, they tried to take the Mickey out of me, but they couldn't take the Maxine out of me. But I will tell you, if I had stayed long enough, I had lined up some people that needed to be prosecuted for exploiting workers because I was gathering the evidence. And I would hate to think that we are allowing Barbadians or anybody or investors, whoever they may be, to exploit anybody from anywhere to the exclusion of providing decent wages to Barbadians. Because you're hearing on the one hand, we either don't have enough, and that's a possibility. But we're also hearing that people don't want work. But my question is, what wages are you offering to people? What terms and conditions? Because we cannot be constructing anything in this country in the name of luxury, in the name of visitor accommodation or anything else in a manner that perhaps is less than acceptable or deemed to be the norm. So I put those questions there. They were fed to me. And I said, the last thing I want to say, is it true that we can expect 300, not nurses this time, but construction workers coming from Ghana in West Africa? And I understand that those workers are supposed to be accommodated at Harrison Point. That's another issue that was brought to my attention. And I told the person I had no such information, but the best I can do is to ask the question. And we can either have a swift, as I said before, a swift denial or a presentation of the facts to Barbadians. Thank you, gentlemen.